How's that? Can you hear me? Yeah, all right, I'm the summer replacement for the person who dropped out. I should preface this by saying, because I only did this over a few days, it's not very polished, it's not very academic, it's not very scholarly, it's slightly scholarly. It's very scholarly, what am I saying? So it's not so much a conference paper as, let's call it a progress report on just some random research I've been doing over the years. I've been interested in this topic for some time, before it was fashionable, I might even say. And I've just found stuff and I've cobbled it together for your amusement. So it's basically a slideshow with some droll comment. Well, I think it's droll. So it's sort of half thematic, half chronological, not definitive, not exhaustive, might get a bit exhausting. So let's just launch in. Fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a bumpy night. Okay, just a little bit of note on terminology, and I actually heard a few people discussing this just before, is drive-in. What does that mean? It's, it's such a vague expression. These days it's actually become a noun. It means drive-in cinema, but really there are a lot, and you'll soon find out how many, a lot of drive-in typologies that occurred between 1955 and 1985, which is sort of how I've just bookended it. There's buildings that that would drive in the sense that you could drive right up to them, and like a drive-in shopping centre, a motel, you drove right up, you got out, you were there, you were at the facility, you could use it, which is quite innovative at the time. Then there's, more strictly speaking, a drive-through building where you didn't actually have to get out of your car to use it. A drive-through car wash, a drive-through restaurant, drive-in cinema, drive-through cinema basically. So this term drive-in was used very, very loosely indeed around the sort of middle third of the 20th century that we're talking about. I say middle third because it's not strictly speaking a post-Second World War phenomenon. There were certainly drive-in buildings in the interwar period. Since we had cars, we basically had drive-in facilities, service stations and what have you. Certainly by the late 1930s, we had increasingly sophisticated petrol stations, car showrooms with drive-in service departments, ramps going up to the second or third story. We also had our first drive-in multi-storey car park in Melbourne, sadly demolished despite being heritage listed, but we won't go into that. So certainly by the late 1930s, everyone was gearing up to a hopeful future of motoring, and then something happened. Basically the war came along. Now, if the words drive and in sort of enthused the pre-war motorist, there were two other words that came along that had the reverse effect, which was namely petrol and rationing. That was actually, rumours of petrol rationing sort of happened almost the day after war was declared in September 1939, but it was about 12 months before they actually introduced it. The magic date was 1st of October 1940. Let's say 9 o'clock in the morning. Petrol rationing, it caused widespread chaos. This is a subject for a different paper really, it's quite fascinating, but people were horrified at being told how much they could use their cars and have to have little tickets to buy petrol. They were horrified. The unfortunate thing was petrol rationing continued after the war actually ended, to a lot of people's chagrin. So this effectively put a hold on the development of drive-in typologies. So not really much happened while petrol rationing was still around. This is the Wilpena Pound Chalet in the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, which was basically a motel in all but name. It was built by the South Australian government as a tourist accommodation, but you drove your car right up to it and walked into your unit. So it was later renamed a motel, but basically that's the earliest motel thing we ever had, 1945. I guess a more sophisticated manifestation would be this building some of you may know, or some of you may remember, the Four Kings Roadhouse in Anglesey from 1947. This was designed by Geelong architects Buchan, Laird and Buchan. Promoted here in this vintage advert as the most modern soda fountain and milk bar in Australia, with meals served down there in Australia's famous glass-enclosed snack bar. So if you think this all smacks of American pop culture, well, that's exactly what it was. Certainly John Buchan of Buchan, Lead and Buchan had just been to America and had been gallivanting around Southern California at the time, so he'd certainly seen some things and came back, and his office designed this, which is very, very much in line with those American precedents and very sort of early inkling of what's going to be a recurring theme in drive-in typologies is this idea of things transplanted from America. Now, another chap from Geelong who was quite enamoured by this building was a young architecture student named Brian O'Connor, who was studying at Gordon Institute in Geelong. That's him there. He later transferred to Melbourne University. There he is on graduation day with Hans Lorraine, Phyllis Murphy and the late Don Fulton, graduating in 1951. Now, Brian's parents ran a hotel down at Geelong, and he became very, very interested in how hotels would change in the automotive era. So in 1949, he had to pick a topic for his design thesis at university and decided he would explore the motel at a time when most people didn't even know what that word meant. So he bounced the idea off his subject supervisor, who happened to be Roy Grounds, who of course had worked in America in the 1930s, including a stint in Hollywood as a set designer in the early 1930s. So Roy certainly knew about roadside architecture, and Roy urged Brian to explore motels for his thesis. And that's just an excerpt there of, from Brian's motel thesis from 1949, showing his idea of parking cars under a little dwelling unit. So this just shows that fuel rationing still existed, but drive-in typologies were still on people's radars. And then finally the good news came. 9th of February 1950, and I'll stop doing this, all right? Petrol rationing was lifted. So now the floodgates were open, or at the risk of mixing a metaphor, I should say the roadblock was opened towards drive-in typologies. And certainly over the next few years, everyone became obsessed with drive-in, this, that, and the other. There were sort of rumours and newspaper reports. Everyone said they were about to start a motel. Every new housing estate would say, yes, this will have an American-style drive-in shopping centre. As early as 1953, I found reports that a drive-in cinema was proposed in Queensland, but that one was never built. That's sort of what happened. There are a lot of these enthusiasm, but nothing really emerged at that time. So really, it wasn't until early 1954 that marked the beginning of the drive-in era in this country, when coincidentally or otherwise, between January and February 1954, we had the earliest recorded examples of 3 different new drive-in typologies all commencing operation. This sort of serendipity was not lost on astute observers such as Neil Clerihan, who wrote about it the week these things opened in his small home service column of The Age, noting that recent announcements warn us that the blessings of the motor car age are about to descend on us in various forms. He talked about the cinema and the drive-in bank that had recently opened. Interestingly, and Neil was also very pro-American himself, but he does ruefully acknowledge here that these sorts of developments were basically appropriated from American sources with a carefree abandon. Neil notes, "It illustrates our unfortunate national habit of carefully selecting the dross of overseas cultures, especially in the field of building and designing." He went on to, he made references to a drive-in church, presumably he was joking about that, and then discussed the drive-in house, which was one with a carport right next to it, of course. Notice that at this early stage in proceedings, the word carport and indeed the word drive-in still needed a coy quotation mark, just in case people didn't quite understand what that meant. So I thought I'd follow this up now with just a little potted history of each of these 3 typologies, the drive-in cinema, the drive-in bank, and the motel, that all kicked off here in early 1954. Firstly, the drive-in cinema. Now I mentioned an abortive attempt was made in August 1953 to open one in Rockley in Queensland, but that was given the thumbs down by the authorities. But by that stage, plans were being already drawn up for one in Melbourne, in Burwood. That would be the very first one in Australia. Now, the architects for the Skyline Drive-In in Burwood were Leith and Bartlett, who are perhaps best known as designers of town halls and banks, but shrewdly in this case they were also financial partners in the venture, and they must have done very well out of that. 10-acre site there on the south side of Burwood Highway near the creek, if anyone knows that neck of the woods. Was what was described as a natural auditorium with space for 600 cars. Opening in January 1954, it was an absolute immediate overnight success. Local residents were appalled and continued to be appalled for many years because traffic would just be banked up everywhere. Rather annoyingly, the entrance was at the back, so everyone had to go up that side street and enter at the back rather than on Burwood Highway, which was the exit. Certainly it opened the floodgates for more drive-ins. By the end of the year there were 2 others in Melbourne, one at Croydon, one at Preston. A few more were proposed interstate during 1954, one in Surfers Paradise, 2 in South Australia. None of those were built though, but certainly for the next few years Melbourne remained the epicentre for drive-in cinemas. There were 4 more open in 1955 and another 4 in 1956. And it was also in 1956 that they finally arrived in New South Wales, where the same Skyline, the same company that built the Burwood one, built the a drive-in at North Ryde, 1956. A few more opened the following year in Sydney, and then later they spread to South Australia and elsewhere. But Victoria still continued to be the hotspot for drive-in cinemas. The first one in regional Victoria opened at Shepparton in 1957, others at Clayton, Broadmeadows, and the one at original one at Burwood continued to expand. It increased its number of car spaces and more buildings were built. I was able to find these drawings for an interesting dining hall with a Maori themed embellishment, also by Leith and Bartlett from 1956 or 7, and a small cream brick sort of bus shelter for people who weren't comfortable sitting in their cars and watching a film. If they thought that was a bit gauche or whatever, you could go and sit in this little shelter and the screen and watch it from there. Like most drive-in cinemas, this one's since closed down and it's actually become the depot of a power company since the 1980s, but miraculously and quite enduringly, a couple of those original buildings still survive, including it's now stripped of its Maori flim-flam, but the dining hall there, or also known as the steakhouse, and this little shed, which used to be for the more coy people to go and watch from who didn't want to sit in their cars. But certainly during the 1960s, drive-ins went on to become more widespread interstate, and more were built in Melbourne as well. But to move on to the drive-in bank, the very first one of those also appeared in Melbourne. You could develop a theory about Melbourne being the sort of ground wellspring for drive-in typologies, perhaps. I won't get into that too much. The first drive-in bank was established by the ES&A Bank in their existing branch at Camberwell Junction. I'm sure some of you know the building. That opened in February 1954. This was designed by Jim Earle, quite an amiable Methodist architect who'd only just started practice at that time. Actually, got the drawings from Jim. As you can see, that the original branch was a 1880s Gothic revival designed by William Wardell, one of few buildings that he designed in Victoria. So that became our first drive-in bank, being located on the corner at the pointy bit of Camberwell Junction. You drove in from one side, drove round to the back of the building, 2 windows, and then you drove out again. That's the floor plan. Strong room was located between the 2 windows. That proved an immediate success, although unlike drive-in cinemas, I suppose, it didn't catch on immediately. This one was the only one for quite a while, and when they finally did spread interstate, it was the ES&A Bank was basically doing it. None of the other banks really bothered with it at that stage. The first one in New South Wales, 1957, was the ES&A Bank in Burwood by Peter Swan. Then first one in Brisbane, 1958, in South Brisbane, and then back to Melbourne again. In 1960, ES&A Bank in Footscray, which was actually promoted as being Australia's first drive-in walk-up bank. So you could, if you were just passing by, you didn't have to go into the bank, you could just walk up to the window. Not sure if that ever caught on. When Perth finally got a drive-in bank in 1961, as you can see, that was a Bank of New South Wales rather than the ES&A Bank, again on a corner, so allowing for driving into the rear through this sort of wonderful tunnel and then out the other side. That bank is still there, looking a little worse for wear now, and you can no longer drive in, or well, maybe you can drive in, you just can't drive out. Now, the motel. I've done a lot of research on the motel, so I'm really kind of cramming this. Unlike cinemas and banks, it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint when the first motel in Australia opened. The word was used very liberally indeed for things that weren't really motels in the sort of academic sense. It's sort of morphic resonance, I suppose, to use an anorak term. People coming up with the same idea at the same time, unaware that other people are coming up with the same idea. Like the invention of the telephone or the radio or vacuum cleaner or even the car itself. So a lot of people have contacted me over the years and they said, oh yeah, my grandmother or my uncle built the first motel in Australia and it was in Tasmania or it was in North Queensland or it was in South Australia. And no, it wasn't. My research to date anyway points to this as being the first motel in Australia, which opened in February 1954. The appropriately named American Motel in Bathurst. That was actually the name of the chain, American Motels, and they went on to become, I guess, our first motel chain. They built several others over the following years, one in Dubbo, one in Tamworth, quite similar architecturally. Certainly the one at Bathurst, it was promoted as being the first American luxury motel in Australia. I've never found out who the architects were. It's been sort of reported ambiguously in various sources. Apparently it was designed by an unidentified Melbourne firm with a local architect supervising it. One contemporary article I found glibly insisted that the design was copied from Yankee motel designs, which is probably true up to a point in terms of the planning. But when you look at the building itself with its terracotta hipped roof and face brickwork, that's a long way from sort of SoCal modernism, and it's really just Australian suburban vernacular. So not really American in its design. Certainly it's an expression of elevations and what have you. The first motel in Australia that really embraced sort of American style motel appearance was the first one in Canberra, which that was under construction in 1955. The AA Motel. Now this was designed by our friend Brian O'Connor, the Melbourne University graduate and motel research whiz kid from 1949. He managed to get this, he actually had to audition for this, and because of his motel experience he leapt to the top of the queue. He was up against some sort of more well-known architects, including Les Perrott. But he got the gig and he designed this, and as you can see this is more pure Los Angeles modernism, flat-roofed sort of courtyard plan of motel units. Very, very sophisticated restaurant at the front. It also included a service station which was off to one side, and that was an enormous success. Opened in early 1956, and AA, which was Accommodation Australia, was a chain. They went on to build other motels, some of which were designed by Brian O'Connor. Now I suppose you're all wondering, well, what about Melbourne? This is the celebrated, iconic and much heralded Oakley Motel. It's got a lot of publicity. It's been added to the State Heritage Register. It's one of the first sort of roadside buildings ever to be thus honoured. That opened in 1957. The original owner was hoping to build it in time for the Olympics, but he didn't quite make it. He was a car dealer by the name of Cyril Lewis. He went to America, came back, and he hired a draftsman to knock up a design for him, inspired by what he'd seen overseas. That's an excerpt of the original drawings and another view of it. This was quite a success in its day, and it was often promoted as being, and even to this day, it's considered Melbourne's first motel. It was advertised as Melbourne's first motel. I've actually discovered one that was built almost 2 years earlier, which is slightly embarrassing in terms of my scholarly work. But motel for Mount Martha, this was actually designed in late 1954 and opened in early 1955, so predates the Oakley motel by about 18 months. Although I suppose strictly speaking, Mount Martha in the 1950s wasn't really technically considered part of Melbourne. This would have been a country motel. More interestingly is that it was designed by Chancellor and Patrick, a Frankston-based firm who are best known for sort of Wrightian residential work, and this is their really only foray into motel design. So technically this was Victoria's first motel, but it's long gone, don't go looking for it. It was demolished in the 1990s. Certainly motels went on to become virulent, I suppose is the word. In the late 1950s they just spread everywhere, and this is just a random sampling of some that were built in the late 1950s, including the one there on the left in the middle, the Caravilla Motel de Ville, some of you may remember on Royal Parade, which was the first motel built in inner Melbourne in 1958. But the number of motels just boomed in the second half of the 1950s. Each year the number of motels pretty much doubled. By the end of 1959 there were 80 motels around Australia, and that's only counting the ones that were sort of the high-end ones that had been given a rubber stamp by the Motel Federation of Australia, not including the sort of smaller fibro ones that sort of just called themselves motels. So what came next? How about the drive-in bottle shop? 1955. Now the earliest reference, if you read Max Freeland's very informative book on the history of the Aussie pub, he points to the Highway Hotel in Plympton in Adelaide as being the first hotel to have a drive-in bottle shop. I haven't found a better photograph than that, so I'm not quite sure what it looked like. The first one in Melbourne is rather better documented. This is the drive-in for beer at the Brighton Cub Hotel on the Nepean Highway. The actual hotel building's still there, but it's no longer a hotel. The drive-in's long gone. As you can see, fairly utilitarian, prosaic structure with a sort of truss canopy to one side. Interesting building at the front with that rooftop signage, Sarah's Bottle Department. Sarah being Ralph Sarakovsky, the publican of the Brighton Cub Hotel at that time. Now this idea caught on. Soon the Chevron Hotel the following year in misspelt Paran opened 1958. Now this one, again, you can see fairly utilitarian design, but it was a massive success, even though the Melbourne City Council loathed it on so many levels. They thought it promoted traffic congestion, they thought it promoted drinking alcohol, and they just thought it was unattractive and demanded that some sort of garden with fountain be built in front of it to stop people having their attention caught and stopping to buy booze. It was ruining everything. But anyway, it persisted, and the idea soon spread interstate. That's an early example in Sydney over there at the Sylvania Hotel and the Hamilton Hotel up in Queensland, 1962. People found this the utmost inconvenience to actually drive through and then drive out again. Now, drive-in restaurants, sadly this is going to overlap with something you may have heard earlier. You may even see the same photo for the third time. But drive-in restaurants, apart from the Anglesey Four Kings Roadhouse that we saw earlier, they really emerged around 1957. The earliest one I've found was actually 1956. This is a wild and whimsical proposal for a shopping centre in Frankston from 1956, which was again done by Chancellor and Patrick, even though it's nothing like anything they've ever done before or since. This was just a speculative development for a local doctor, and it was a shopping centre, an office building, and this wonderful donut-shaped, what was described as a drive-in cafe with 3 palm trees growing out the middle and perimeter parking. Rather more Laverne and Shirley than Chancellor and Patrick. But never built, so that was a loss. The earliest one I've ever found that was actually built was the Boolarong Park Inn on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, which opened just before Christmas 1957. It's a sort of pure drive-in restaurant where you could pull your car in and be served in your car. Now, this was actually founded by a British migrant, Mrs. Betsanne Coates, who migrated here and wondered why we didn't have drive-in restaurants here. They had them back home, why didn't they have them here? And this is almost a sort of recurring theme in drive-in typologies, and particularly drive-in restaurants, of being introduced by American or British migrants who were familiar with them and thought, well, why aren't they here? I'll build one. This one was an immediate success. And as you can see, drive your car right up and be served in your car. It only operated in this form for a few years. Ironically, it became so successful that it was enveloped with subsequent additions. It had 2 more stories added and it was expanded, and it became a hotel and restaurant complex called the Boolarong Hotel. apparently the favoured place for Sean Connery and his wife Deanne Cilento to hang around in the 1960s. It's since been demolished, but a lot of people fondly remember the Boolarong Drive-In for that brief period when it operated like this. Now this has been mentioned, but this is Melbourne's counterpart, Rob's Drive-In in Albert Park, which opened in early 1960. Now Rob, with two B's, Griffith was an American, so coming back to this idea that someone comes over who is very familiar with a particular type and establishes it here. Rob Griffith was from San Francisco. He came here and he opened his drive-in restaurant there. You can see being served in your car by a very nattily attired waitress. This operated for a few years, was later integrated into Rob's Carousel. Rob later had a go at a multi-storey revolving restaurant for the island in the middle of Albert Park Lake, which lamentably was never built. But this was a success in its day. Certainly a more well-known example in Sydney, which opened later in 1960, was Lee Gordon's Drive-In Restaurant. That was a venture of Lee Gordon, the record producer, concert promoter, and every other thing. He was also an American. He was from Detroit, so for him to come out here and again, why don't they have these sorts of things in Australia? I know, I'll build one. He built one which was simply and modestly called Lee Gordon's Drive-In Restaurant. And as you can see from this contemporary promo, Australia's first real drive-in restaurant direct from America. And it was indeed direct from America. You may have already picked up that the design of Lee Gordon's was, can we say, subtly influenced by the original McDonald's, including the striped, right down to the stripes. He just lopped off the top of the arches, basically. And even more concerning, his logo, the little Lee Gordon's Burger Boy, was, that's an exact copy of the Manners Big Boy logo, right down to the slingshot in his back pocket. But it was quite a success for a few years, or about a year. I often wonder if Big Boy and these other firms in America knew this was going on here. The answer may lie in the fact that during 1961, Lee Gordon had some legal trouble, which I've yet to delve into, over this restaurant, and it in late 1961 it reopened as a Big Boy's restaurant. So I wonder what happened there. It later became Beefy's 24-hour diner in the 1970s, and it was sold in the early 1980s. And interestingly, it wasn't promoted as being a site for a drive-in restaurant. It was sold as being ideal for a drive-in, for a car yard. So sort of one drive-in building type becomes another, as it were. Sadly, it was demolished in the early 80s. So again, don't go looking for it. Now, so this really brings us up to 1960. We've become very, very comfortable with this idea of driving into things. We've got drive-in cinemas, drive-in banks, drive-in restaurants, motels. What else could we drive into? The ideas kept coming and sometimes merged in amusing and unexpected ways. This is Shandon's Motor Hotel in South Australia, which was built shrewdly next to an existing drive-in cinema. Now, the motel developers planned the motel so that those on some of the upstairs rooms not only got a view of the actual drive-in screen, but it was finagled so that they had speakers in their room, so that they could, and I hope this was all done in an authorised sense, but so they could actually sit in their room and watch their movie. So this was really a theme park for the drive-in typology enthusiast. You can see there was also a service station over there, and here a drive-in bottle shop. So, you know, into the drive-in bottle shop, get the booze, back to the motel room for a movie. What more could you want? I don't know how successful this was. This is the only example of this particular sort of hybrid type that I've come across. 1964, we had a drive-in tourist bureau up in Queensland, which was a branch of the Government Tourist Bureau. It was promoted as being the first of its type in Queensland and possibly Australia. I've definitely not found another one of where the busy tourist can just pull in for quick directions to, I don't know, the nearest motel or drive-in bottle shop, and then on your way again. So I'm not quite sure if that caught on, but certainly Queenslanders seemed sort of late coming to the drive-in party. They seemed to be on the ball by the mid-60s because it was there that we also had the first drive-through car wash. And again, this is one of these interesting sort of migrant crossovers. This was established by two British migrants, two boys from Leicester in the UK who married some sisters and came out here, and then they established this. As far as I can tell, the first drive-in car wash in Australia. Not automatic, but they boasted that their team of polishers and rubbers could wash your car in 5 minutes without you getting out of the car. Again, not quite sure how successful that was. I haven't been able to even locate where it was. Certainly the first automatic car wash, drive-in car wash, opened later that year in Melbourne, and that was associated with Rex, the car dealership on the Nepean Highway. Rex Hunt, yep. So that was, I haven't found a photograph of it though, so if anyone knows, if anyone ever went there. Reg Hunt. Fishbowl, yeah. Familiar. Okay, Reg Hunt, yep. So by the mid-1960s, we'd had drive-in buildings for about 10 years, so the time was right to sort of re-evaluate and reconsider some of those earlier ones and see what could be done with them. Certainly drive-in banks were becoming popular again after sort of a bumpy start. The State Savings Bank of Victoria had their first go at it in 1966 with this sort of wonderful sort of hexagonal spaceship on Doncaster Road at Doncaster East. This one really was sort of quite special. Again, it's gone, don't go looking for it. Opened 9th of September 1968. Was quite successful for a while. A lot of people sort of saw it more as a novelty. Certainly cartoonist and failed architect Bill Green had his opinion of it. For $500 deposit, you could at least wipe my windscreen. But really it was the ES&A Bank that continued to sort of corner the market in drive-in banks. And by the late 1970s, they'd built about a dozen of them in Melbourne, including this one just down the road in Swanston Street. Some of you may recall being there. But again, these were integrated with existing banks. They weren't just standalone drive-in banks. Another example in New South Wales in action. And here's one in Ringwood, which is actually miraculously still there. It no longer operates as a bank, but the infrastructure still remains. To give you an idea about how it actually worked, there were speakers so that you could have a private conversation and this sort of two-way drawer that you could put your money in securely. Some of the banks also provided a parking space, so if you needed to run in and speak to the manager very quickly, you could do that as well. But really, it didn't catch on. I don't know when the last drive-in bank in Melbourne closed. It was probably this one. I don't remember any in, let's say, less than 20 years of motoring. Drive-in bottle shops, they'd got a pretty shabby reputation by the 1960s. They were never, the early ones were never very architecturally brilliant, but by the late 1960s there were these attempts to sort of rehabilitate their sort of grotty reputation. Some designers went for a sort of American Googie style things, such as this Kay's Hotel bottle shop in Dandenong, which is still there, with this wonderful sort of Californian style signage. It's a great one. Others, example in Sydney that went for a more sort of low-key Frank Lloyd Wright sort of style. And then this one in Mosman that sort of went for a more domestic scale, touch of Oriental pagoda perhaps, but just to make them seem a little bit classier than they really were. And in much the same way, this idea of getting notable architects involved, some of these were designed by quite eminent architects who obviously took guilty pleasure in working on a sort of rather sort of frivolous building type. Peter Muller's work for the Hoyt's cinema empire has been mentioned. When they started to tart up their drive-ins in the late 1960s, they got Peter to design some of these projection booths and restaurants in this sort of remarkable sort of Babylonian ziggurat fantasy kind of thing. Which was quite amazing stuff. And of course he also did the Hoyt Cinema Centre here in Burke Street. When the Toorak Drive-In Cinema, which despite its name was in East Hawthorn, when they cleaned that up in the late 1960s, they had some very smart modernist buildings designed by the talented but mysterious Alexander Harris, about whom I'm writing a book. So if anyone knows anything, come and talk. this is one of my favourites, California Jim's Drive-In, in with two N's, get it? Brilliant. Which opened in 1968, despite looking extremely 50s, so it was sort of a latecomer to the party. But this sort of answers the architectural question. What if Philip Cox had designed sets for Happy Days? Interesting sort of almost proto-fishbowl. Is that a stylistic label? A little hexagonal or polygonal building with this sort of disc-like circular roof supported on cables from a post. It wasn't actually designed by Philip Cox, but it was designed by a certain venerable and eminent architectural practice in Sydney of the day. And this building has never been mentioned in any of the monographs or scholarly studies of their work. Lock and Woolley. But this wasn't much of a success. It only operated for a few years and then was adapted into a car yard. So again, this weird nexus between drive-in typologies eating themselves. This we're probably sick of seeing by now. Another eminent architect, Bruce Rickard, having a go at a drive-in restaurant in Tempe. And Bruce Rickard was also the architect for the Whale Car Wash in Gordon, which is possibly the only drive-in car wash ever designed by an architect who's won the RAIA 25-year award. But architect designed car washes, they didn't really catch on. Certainly by the mid-1970s we started to see the ones that are now, we still see today, sort of just a brick corridor that you drive into, nothing too architecturally spectacular. So this takes us through into the 1970s. What could possibly be left to drive into now? Au contraire, the drive-in telephone booth, which is emerged in the late 1970s. First one in Melbourne opened at Eastland Shopping Centre in Ringwood in 1979. Another one emerged in Geelong the following year. And then in 1981, which was designated as International Year of the Disabled, apparently a whole lot of them were built all around the country. I don't know where this one was. If anyone can recognise it from the buildings in the background, I'd be interested to know. I don't think they ever really caught on. I don't ever remember seeing any of them. They were ultimately intended for use for people in wheelchairs. Yes, more of a novelty, I think, than anything else. Now, I did promise to bring this story up to 1985. Some of you may know this building, the Penguin Drive-In Dry Cleaner in Bulleen. The Penguin Dry Cleaning Company had occupied a site there since the late 1940s, and in the mid-1980s they built this new front on the old premises that allowed people to drive in, drop off, pick up. That was quite a success, and that still remains in operation. And there were certainly a few imitators. Some of you may remember this, the Peninsula Drive-In Dry Cleaner on the Old Nepean Highway out at Seaford, which is opened in 1995. You may think, that looks a bit familiar. Could that have been a Kentucky Fried Chicken that was adapted? And of course you're correct. So we've seen drive-in restaurants turned into car parks and second-hand car dealers. Now drive-in restaurants adapted as drive-in dry cleaners, just proving that when it comes to drive-in typologies, all roads do lead to Rome. Thank you.